All right, let's talk about HTML. Right, so HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, right? And it's just basically a derivation of the XML language, right, that allows to format or add meta information about plain text, right? So typically you have just a plain ASCII file, right? And then you can start annotating it, right, using XML, right, to give it some meta information about the information about the text, right, that can then be used by other pieces of software, right, so that they know how to interpret or how to process that particular piece of text. Right? In our case, right, we're using a version of XML which is called HTML. Right? It's a particular vocabulary of XML that allows you to wrap text, to tell the browser, how things should be rendered, right? That certain things should be rendered as headings, other ones as paragraphs, tabs, tables, lists, headings, and whatnot. Okay, and so yeah, so typically the text is just plain text, right? And then you just wrap it with these tags, right, to be able to format and tell the browser how to format the plain text. Now, typically these are uh, uh, just ASCII files, right, that have the extension of .html. Now, we're not going to be working with .html, right, but nevertheless, it's useful to understand where we're coming from, where the low-level implementation is, right? How does it work, right? And this is what the browser understands, right? These are the syntax that it understands. What we're doing is that we're using JavaScript to generate this dynamically, right, on the fly. Okay, and so JavaScript using functions, for loops, right, arrays, if statements, and whatnot, right, to programmatically generate this HTML with heads and bodies and all the tags and whatnot. Okay, so some of this is specific to plain all HTML, which we're not going to be using plain old HTML, but nevertheless, it's useful, at least historically, to know what's happening behind the scenes, right? So, for instance, we have in the head, we have references to other documents such as CSS files, JavaScript files, other things that the document depends on, right? So, and what the browser does is that it downloads first the HTML, and then the HTML might have references to other files, right? CSS files, HTML files, image files. And what it'll do is that the browser will initiate simultaneous requests, out to the server, fetching all these files independently, right? And some of these files might not necessarily be in the same server, right? Some of them might be from Bootstrap, or they're from jQuery, or they're from React.js, right? And so it will download, from the different servers, right, and bring them all together and coalesce them into the browser for rendering one single screen, right? In our case, we do have one single HTML that we do care about, right, which is the entry point over here, right? It's this one right there. This is the only HTML document that we are only ever going to care about, and no other HTML document, right? And actually, this HTML document is the only document that ever loads, right, in a React application. And we say that this is what's called a single page application, right? And what we mean by that is that it used to be, when we implement applications using plain old HTML, we would have multiple documents that reference each other through hyperlinks. That you would click on one, right? And then it would download the other HTML document. That's what you would see. And you click on that one, then it download the other one, so on and so forth. So that's how you implemented navigation. Now today, that's still supported obviously with browsers, but in single page application, modern React application like this, or Angular, Vite, right? They Vue, they implement what is called single page application. What it means is that the only HTML document that is loaded, right, is one, and then we never leave that HTML document. You might say, well, how do you navigate, right? How do you go from one screen to another screen, right? So what we do is that instead, right, we have infrastructure that what we'll do is that, if you click on certain things, right, it will hide certain pieces of the screen and then show other pieces of the screen, right? In effect, giving you the illusion that you are navigating, from one screen to another, right? But indeed, there's only ever one HTML document that only loads, right? And then all other navigation is simulated, right, by hiding and showing different parts of the content, right? And we'll get to that today to show you how is it that we do it dynamically using React, right? Okay. Yeah, so we have the HTML root tag. We have the head that has for um, defining meta information, such as the title, references to other documents, the author, things like that, meta information. And then in the body is where you actually have the content, right? And in here, you could have something that is plain text like this, but then you would add additional tags to format it in different ways, right? To show things as the headers, paragraphs. Now, what the browser does is that it takes the HTML, right, and it converts it, it parses it, and it converts it into a object representation in memory called the DOM, right? DOM stands for Document Object Model, right? And what this is it's a hierarchical structure that mirrors the source HTML, right? But whereas the HTML is ASCII text, right, that you can edit just with a regular text editor, the DOM is a binary in-memory representation of that same data structure. So it's the same information, but represented in memory with nodes, right? It's a tree. It's an inverted tree with the HTML tag represents the HTML node, right, which is at the root, right, that then points to two other nodes that represents the head node and the body node, right, and then recursively, right, pointing down to even further down the depth of the tree, right, up until the branches and the leaves of this tree are what render things on the screen, right? And so by default, it just parses HTML, and spits out the DOM, and the DOM is what the browser renders, right? Looks at the DOM, right, and that's what gets. And so what we're going to do is that we can generate the DOM either by typing the HTML text, right, or right, using JavaScript to programmatically generate the contents, right, that we can we can have the algorithm, right, calculate what the content is, right, and add things to the DOM, manipulate the DOM, right, by adding, removing things, right, and then you would see on the screen the effects, right, of manipulating that DOM programmatically, right. So now browsers give you tools to see what the DOM looks like. So let me show you. So for instance, here, right, we have the browser running locally, and this is the content that we see. Right now, we can see the ASCII that the browser thinks they are parsing and they are rendering. We can see the page source. This is what gets downloaded from the server, and you'll see that there's not much, right? We see some HTML, the head, the script, right? We have meta, blah, 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 div, root. Notice that the body doesn't have much, right? So you might ask, and it says, wait a minute, where's the content, right? Where's this text, right? I don't see the text here at all, right? Instead, notice that it has a reference to his main.tsx, see that? And that main.tsx has the JavaScript that runs, right, and injects or inserts, right, the content dynamically into the DOM, right, and then the DOM gets manipulated into this div right here, this div root right there, and this is what the results of that, right. Now you can see the resulting DOM after having been manipulated by looking at inspect. You can say inspect, right? And it opens this tool, right? This is the developer tools, and this is kind of like a looking behind the curtain, right? In the Wizard of Oz or Neo, right? In the Matrix, and seeing what the reality of the Matrix of how things are really, right? So this is kind of like behind the scenes. This is really the real world, right? And this is the rendering of that world, okay? And what we see here is that now this div root that we saw here as a source, right? Here we see it as empty, but here we see it not empty. We see that the div root actually contains a header, type 1, that says, welcome to full stack MERN web application, right? The actual content. So this, what has happened is that this is what gets downloaded from the server, plus the JavaScript here, the TypeScript, which runs, and as it runs, it injects content, this welcome to full dev, into the ID div with the ID root. Now, where did that happen? So that happened in the source code. If you look at the source code, you'll notice that in this XML, it has that div, the root, which is empty. There's nothing in there. And what happens in main text is where the magic happens, right? What happens is that it uses plain old JavaScript to read the DOM, right? The document object. The document object is a very low level reference to that data structure, the DOM data structure. And it allows you to read from it, right? So for instance, here we're saying, okay, well, find me an element whose ID is root, right? Indeed, there is one, right? It's this one right here, this div. So it finds the div, and what does it do? It says, okay, well, once you have a reference to that element, right, that is the root of the React application. And in there, I'm going to render the following. Okay, what am I going to render? So I have this strict mode, which we'll talk about that in a minute, and then app. And then app is, as we saw earlier, is a function that what it does is just returns the content, whatever content we tell it to return, which is returning the H1 welcome to full stack MERN, which is what we see injected into the root. See that? That's where, right, the magic happens, and we see that the root, right, gets injected of the content of H1. So the rest of the course is basically, right, writing this function, a whole bunch of other functions that cumulative, right, are going to aggregate the returns of each one of these functions into one big DOM, right, that is going to be injected into the root, right, and then rendered on the screen. Okay, make sense? All right. Yeah. So we have the window is in the DOM represented as the overall browser that has a reference to the document, as the root, right, that has then references to the head, right, the body, and then references to headings and links and whatnot. Okay. So let's talk about some of the simpler formatting things that you could do with HTML, right? So some of the simplest things that you do is to use headings and paragraphs, right, to break up the main portion, main content into sections, right, that introduce different topics. So we're going to be using it to break up various topics for HTML, right? For instance, we're going to first talk about headings and then paragraphs and lists, tables, and so on and so forth, right? So we can use headings, right, to be able to break up our content that way, right? So this is taken from the exercises in the book, right? And which I refer to as the lab exercises, right? Now you're responsible for completing all the lab exercises, and most of them are ask you to copy and paste content, right, from the lab exercises, and then ask you to go a little bit beyond and says, okay, well, having seen how to do it, right, as an example, right, then now do it on your own, right? Create one version of this, but with your own content, right? And the idea of these lab exercises are for you to practice, right, and gain some confidence, right, on using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. Now, typically, a lot of you have already seen a lot of this content, HTML, CSS, but some of you haven't. Usually, I have like a half split between students that find this boring because they've taken it, and the other half is I've never seen this. Right? I've done a lot of very um, sophisticated programming, but I've never done user interfaces, so this is all very novel to me. Right? So hopefully some of you, half of you will be bored, and half of you will be challenged. Right? So I'll try to walk the thin middle between those two. So headings, there are different versions of headings, right? H1 all the way through H6 that start off with the biggest level, biggest, boldest, in size and headings, right? To give you to ask for your attention for a particular section, in the content, right? And then you have smaller ones, very much like you would find in a word processor, right? Different versions of the headings, right? So here's the largest one. Now, a little bit on syntax, taken from XML, right? We're using the XML syntax where here we have an opening tag and you have the closing tag. The difference is that the opening tag doesn't have the slash, right? And the closing tag has the slash, right? And usually for one opening tag, you have the closing tag. Also, the what's in between the content, between the two tags, we call it the body, right, of the tag. Now, some tags don't have bodies, right? So they have a self-closing tag. We'll see an example of that in a minute. But here are just a couple of headings. And typically you have H1 being the biggest, and then multiple H2s, which are the big sections with H1s, and then the subsections with H2. Now, from the exercise that we asked you in the book, right here, we can start creating lab exercises where we can practice these skills, right? So we're going to have multiple labs, one lab per assignment or per chapter. So let's set it up, right? We can work through these as we go. So, for instance, what we're going to do is that in the source, we're going to create a folder called labs, right? And under there, for each chapter, right, we're going to have a different lab. So we're going to have a folder for lab 1, right? Actually, under the labs, right here. And then we're going to have another folder for lab 2, and so on and so forth, right? So we're going to have for lab 3 and etc. Right? So for lab 1, right, each folder has an entry point, right, of what to render there, right, by default. Okay, and default files, right, in the web world, right, they are all named index. So index, when you see index, right, that means that this is the default file or script, right, or style sheet, right, that is going to be loaded, right, if you don't specifically ask for anything, right? So, for instance, this index.html is what gets rendered here, right? Because we're not asking for anything in particular, right? We can either ask for it explicitly /index.html, but if we don't, we are assuming that that's the document that you want, right? So same thing here. Lab 1, we're going to create an index.tsx. This is going to be the default content of Lab 1, which is going to include many exercises, each in its own file. Or for this particular example, we're going to have all the exercises in one single file, right? In later chapters, we're going to practice having content in multiple files, right, spread out over multiple files as opposed to just one. But just because we're just introducing the basics, we're going to do all the work in one single file, right? All right, so here, all these are going to be functions that calculate the output of what it is that we want to render. So for lab one, for instance, we want to render, a heading that says lab one. Okay, so let's do that. So we'll go to export, default, function, lab one, and we're going to return, right, a div. Okay, sure. I'm using a tool. It's an AI tool that has been learning from me and from prior labs. So it already knows what I'm going to type. And so let's see. So there's H2. We'll do H2 here, and this will be lab one. All right. So this is going to be our lab one. Now div is a tag, an HTML tag that is typically used for dividing. Right, it's a division. Right, and it allows you to logically divide the content in rectangular chunks. Right, and also it adds vertical spacing. Right, so each lab will have its own vertical space. Right? And then we have a heading. So I'm going to use H2, and so that it'll be a subsection of labs. Right, so lab two will also be another subsection for lab two, and so on and so forth. Right. So yeah, so that's we call this a component, right? The intent is that this would be a self-contained modular component that I can then combine and aggregate, right, to build ever more complex content, right? And that's one of the things that React.js promotes, is that if you see a large, very complex user interface, right, immediately you should start splitting it up or thinking on how to split it up into subcomponents that you can then aggregate, right, like little Legos, right, and put together to build the entire screen, right, or small portion, very complex component, right, UI component, and then multiple screens that you can navigate between them, right. So right now, lab one here is the component that aggregates all the exercises for lab one, and we might do the same thing for lab two, right, but we'll do that a little later. So yes, we have index here, and then lab itself is going to have its own entry point, index.tsx, and this will be export default function labs, and so this is going to import lab one, right, from lab one, and this is going to return a div that says H1 labs, and then lab one right there. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so notice what we did here, right? We imported lab one from a folder lab one. There's the folder lab one, and I didn't specify index.tsx because what we're really importing is index.tsx. That's really what we are importing, right? But I don't need to do that, right? It is understood, or it's implied because of the name index.tsx. So I don't have to explicitly say that I am importing the index.tsx, right? I can just say lab one, and it is implied that it's that index file, right? Very much like we did earlier here, right? That I can either type index.html or not, right? It's implied. Also notice that that it is the function that is being exported here, and in here is being imported as a function, the same name, although I could rename it here, and then I'm using it as a tag. See that? So this is where the JSX syntax that combines both syntaxes and allows you to go back and forth between them comes in, right? Where you can treat a function like a tag, and what it does is that it calls the function, and whatever the function returns, this is what gets replaced. So this is equivalent to doing this, right? It's equivalent to doing that, which I'm not, right? Right. So what it allows you to do is just create ever more complex little components and then bring them together, right? Like that, right? Okay. And finally, in my top level app TSX, what I'll do is that I will import the labs. We'll import the labs, right? And here I'm just going to do, div, and oops, and this is labs. Ah, that. Okay. So if we go back to our, there we go. So this is the content, labs, then lab one. Make sense? Okay. And then you would have maybe a lab two, right? We'd have a index.tsx. This would be, export default lab two. There we go. And then in labs, we could bring both labs. So import lab two, right? And then just render it right underneath lab two. Save that. And then there it is. So we have lab one, lab two, and so on and so forth. For now, they all render on the same screen. A little later, we'll show you how we can do navigation so that, I see lab one if I click on lab one, or lab two if I click on lab two and I navigate to that particular screen. But we'll do that a little later. Everybody okay? All right. Okay. Yeah. So now we can start playing around with headers. Although we understood what headers are, right? So we have headers allow us to introduce content. Here we have an example, and we're doing this on lab one index.tsx. This is one of the first exercises in chapter one. Work on that, copy the content, paste it in there. Make sure that the content that you copy, like for instance this one, right, that you paste it. If you go to lab one, lab one, that you paste it in here, right? Not at the bottom here, obviously, right? Not outside of the div, right? Make sure that you paste it inside of this bottom div over here. So right there. Yeah. So paste that. So that's the content from the lab exercise, right? And then you could make sure that it renders as expected, right? Notice that I have my tool open here. As developers, we should always have that tool open, right? Because as developers, what we're doing is that we are manipulating the DOM, right, to accomplish a certain rendering on the screen, right? So, but what we're really doing is that we're manipulating this DOM, right, with the intent that it will render one way or another here on the screen, right? So there's some examples that introduce paragraphs, right? Making the point that by default, content is not formatted. That even if you add extra spaces, extra tabs, extra new lines, right? Those are ignored by the browser. Actually, our IDE also ignores them, and that only if you explicitly add formatting like paragraphs and lists and whatnot, then right it renders with that formatting, right? So here's an example of a paragraph that we can add here. And so there it is. So here's our little paragraph here. But then, right, if you just have just simple text, if you just have simple text over here like that, now we do have the extra space here. We have the new tab, right? We have some new lines here. But if I save it, my IDE knows that the browser is going to ignore all that extra space, right? So it's just going to jumble up all together, right? Knowing the fact that the browser is just going to ignore all my extra spaces, right? So that if I render here, notice that it jumbles up into one single paragraph, right? That if I really want to maintain that formatting of new lines and the vertical gap between them, I have to explicitly add these tags, okay, like that, right? So now, right, it renders as expected with the gap in between the paragraphs, okay. We also have lists, right, that allows us to render things either bulleted or with a numeric lists, right? Like if you want to now these use a combination of tags. They use first a kind of like an overall wrap around other tags, where uh, you have individual line items, right, formatted with dedicated LI tags, right, where you list all the line items individually, and then overall you wrap an opening UL and a closing UL, right? And there's two versions of the list. One is for unordered, which is bulleted, just plain old bullets, meaning that there's no particular order of interest, right? Whereas you have ordered lists, OL, right, which will add numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can configure it to use Roman numerals or letters or a combination of both. Right. So the exercise asks you to create a list, and making the point, right, that by default, notice that even though I added the numbers and I added the new lines because they should be listed in individual, in its own line, it's going to ignore it, right? So if I save this, right, notice that it just jumbles it up all together, right, and that it doesn't render as expected, right? Yeah, notice that just is not really what we want, right? So instead, if we do want to keep the format, we do need to wrap this in its dedicated OL if it's ordered, and that we have to add the LIs, right, for each item if we want to add the formatting. So let me copy that and put it here and here, like that, like that, like that, like that, like that, and close this one. There we go. So now we recuperate the format, and it does render with its own numeral. The assignment goes on to ask you to to come up with the list of your own, right, with your own recipe and whatnot, right, and gives you some examples on doing something that is unordered, like for instance your favorite books. So yeah, so work on that.